All right, guys, another day, another strength. Got another video today. This one, the question is, should you squat to depth? The short answer is yes. So we're going to talk about why, right? Let's get into that. So there are two main reasons for squatting. One is strength, one is to build muscle, right? And there's a ton of overlap between the two. So we're going to kind of break those down into their parts a little bit, right? So number one, training for strength, the biggest one, right? If you're competing in some way, generally in powerlifting, the rule in pretty much all powerlifting federations is that the crease of the hip must drop below the top of the kneecap or the patella, and you must abide by the rules in this competition. Most of the time, some federations get a little loose with the judging, and you can get away with some high squats. But generally, that is the rule. So right there, that's number one, like your main reason to squat to depth, right? It is the rules. Don't break the rules, or you won't. Your squats won't count. If you're not competing, right, there can be a case made for squatting high, but let's talk about why it's probably not a great idea. Number one, you have to train through a range of motion to get stronger in that range of motion. So if you're only half squatting, you're only going to get strong through half of the range of motion as far as your knees and hips, right? And then the thing is that your half squat will increase if your full squat increases, right? So if you do a full depth squat, your half squat's going to go up. But vice versa, that's not necessarily true. Like increasing your half squat is not necessarily going to carry over to your full range of motion squat. The only reason to do partial squats is if you want to, right? And the hip crease rule is a good approximation of the deepest point one can reach without having to either loosen something up or lose balance, right? So if you watch a guy like Clarence Kennedy, for example, he goes like super, super deep, ass to grass. And if you watch his squat closely, he actually kind of loses balance a little bit at the bottom, winds up a little forward on his toes, and then he kind of rebounds out of the hole kind of this way in almost like a C shape. So his hips shoot up, which is different from like, you know, the hip drive that you're going to have at the bottom of the squat. His hips actually kind of shoot backwards, which you don't want to happen, which means that you are off balance forward in the bottom. So your body is kind of like overcorrecting, trying to rebalance the barbell and your combined center of mass over your midfoot, right? But speaking of the muscles involved, so they kind of have to loosen up if you go super deep. So that's why it's also a good idea to not go like super, super deep, right? Because usually the counter with people that are half squatting is they'll say like, why not just go like ass to grass? That's why you don't want to go ass to grass if you're training for strength, right? So let's talk about the anatomy of this a little bit. So if you only go halfway down, you're basically omitting the hamstrings to a large degree because the hamstrings, they cross both the knee joint and the hip joint. They're primarily responsible for hip extension, but you're not really breaking at the hip that much, and you're also not really breaking at the knee that much. So you're not working either, you're not bringing either muscle through a long range of motion as far as like the hamstring across the hips and the quads across the knee, and also the hamstring across the knee as well, right? But you are going to put a larger degree of force on the knee joint by doing that. So that can open the door for issues like tendonitis, patellar tendonitis, quad tendonitis, stuff like that on the anterior side of the knee, the front of the knee, right? And you're going to put just a ton of stress in general on the joints. And so now I am a proponent of, I believe that you can basically load any range of motion. If you do it incrementally, you're going to adapt to it, right? But there is a limit to that, right? If you're just putting like tons and tons of weight and tons of stress on your joints, so it's not just your hip and your knee joint, but also like your low back. At a certain point, it's like, why would you do that when you could also get the same or a similar effect with a longer range of motion, like a deadlift or a rack pull or something like that, right? If you want to do a partial range of motion, lower body lift, like the rack pull is a better bet because you can lift more weight. So if your goal is to lift a ton of weight, that's going to give you it's a better option for that goal, right? Which is a topic for a different video. But you're going to put less stress on the joints by squatting to full depth, which is going to increase your recovery a little bit. You're not going to be as achy. You can do it more often, have more frequency. With a partial movement, you're going to need more reps to equate the stress that you would get from a full range of motion as well. And the same is true of rack pulls, right? If you've ever tried that, like you go from a deadlift to a rack pull, it's actually a lot less stress acutely until you get the weight super, super, super heavy. And you get really adapted to that movement and you get good at lifting a ton of weight. It takes a long time to work up to the point where like a set of 5 rack pulls is equivalent to a set of 5 deadlifts. It needs to be much, much heavier than your deadlift in order for that to happen. And sometimes you can't even get it there just because of, you know, the way your body's built or, you know, just the way that you're training or whatever it may be, right? And so in that case, in order to equate the stress, you need a lot more sets and a lot more reps. So all that being said, if you still want to squat high, you can still do that, right? And that's your decision, but you just have to be open to the criticism that you're going to get and be ready to defend your position, which you may not be able to based off this information I've just laid out, right? So if you like accept all that and you're like, yeah, like I just like to do it, I just want to do it, then that's great. Like, but just be honest about that, right? Don't try to pretend like it's better. Don't try to pretend like, the 90-degree joint angle is going to be better for strength or better for muscle growth or something like that, because it's not. And then on the muscle side of things, right? Basically, Dr. Mike Israetel has entered the chat here, right? Go check out any of his stuff. He's a big proponent of the long range of motion. Team Full ROM is his little like clothing brand there. But yeah, as far as trying to build muscle with a half squat, the amount of sets and reps needed to basically like produce a good enough stimulus to grow muscle becomes very unwieldy. The same can be true of like a powerlifting style bench press compared to a long range like close grip bench, right? If you've ever tried that, you'll notice that a close grip bench you can get away with a couple sets, whereas like a wide grip powerlifting bench you have to do a whole bunch of sets to get the same degree of stimulus on the target muscle. So if you're trying to like squat to grow your quads, for example, right, you're better off doing like a super ass to graft with like maybe a pause in the bottom. And if you're just doing half squats, then it's going to take you a lot more volume to get there. And in that case, the SFR, stimulus to fatigue ratio, becomes unfavorable because then you're just beating the heck out of your low back and your glutes and your hip joint and your knee joint and all this other stuff, just trying to get like, the desired effect on your quads when you could have gotten that with just a couple sets of a different style of squatting. And then also, if you are half squatting, you're omitting a great deal of muscle fibers by only going through half the range of motion because you're omitting the other half of the range of motion, right? So the muscles are not stretching fully. The actin and myosin filaments, right, the sliding filament theory, those actin and myosin filaments are not fully cross-bridging as you get to the second half of that range of motion. So you are going to have issues with getting your muscles as big as possible if they are like leaving out half of their function essentially, as far as the muscles that cross the knee and the hip joint. So anyways, you might be watching this and you're like, well, Michael, I can't hit depth. And I can tell you right now, that's nonsense, right? There's three main reasons why some people may not hit depth and they think that they're not able to, but they think it's usually the reason they think is because it's like a flexibility issue, or most people just like, I feel like they just like to ego lift, so they just don't bother to actually do it. But the main reasons why you are not able to squat to depth, number one is a balance issue. So as you're getting towards the bottom of the squat, you are losing balance either by you're trying to stay like super vertical, or you have the bar in like a weird place on your back. A big one is like people will be looking at like the ceiling or like somewhere super far away, so they can't balance very well. Like if you watch like a high school weight room, the dudes aren't going to squat to depth because they're trying to look at the ceiling and keep their chest super high up as they squat down. So they're shifting their balance forward because the knees are going forward, but they're not leaning over, so the hips aren't going back. And then as they get towards the bottom, they start to kind of like tip over, so their natural, sense of self-preservation tells them to come back up. And then they're like, oh, bro, I'll do like the Dr. Mike Israetel voice because he came up in this video. And they're like, yeah, bro, like I start to, just not flexible enough to get to the bottom. But they're actually losing balance during the lift, which is not good, not ideal. The second reason that you're not hitting depth may be a strength issue, like you're just not strong enough to hit depth. Usually it's because you're trying to lift way too much weight and you're used to doing the half squat and you don't want to, take the ego hit of going down to a much lighter weight and actually squatting that to depth. Or in the case of like older individuals, they just don't have the strength to squat their body weight. Like that happens. And then sometimes in younger people too, if you're super, super skinny, often in women that are just like, they've been caught by the myth that they need to be like as skinny as possible. And I've seen women in their 30s that are like atrophied to the point where they can't squat to depth, which is kind of sad. And then thankfully we're able to help them, but there are a lot of people out there like that. And then the last reason that you cannot squat to depth, this one is actually a lot more valid, is if you have like the cartilage tear, like a labrum tear, or you have something wonky with your hip, there's impingement, something like that. And in that case, you generally need a hip replacement. Like usually it's not something that can be mitigated with your form. Sometimes if it's like an impingement thing, you can kind of like, make sure you're turning your toes out to the side, make sure that your stance is in the proper spot, which kind of ties in with my point number one, which is the balance, right? So the stance can be a reason for not hitting depth, because if your stance is too narrow, you're going to lose balance as you try to get to the bottom. Or if it's too wide, your adductors are going to stretch too much before you can get to the bottom. So that is going to mess with your depth. But generally, if you're not able to get there without like a whole bunch of pain, it's usually a cartilage thing or like a surgical, like orthopedic situation where you need to get that sorted out, then you can squat properly. But in general, like everyone can squat to depth without pain if they don't have one of those issues, right? So I've never met someone that could not, unfortunately, for the high squatter gang out there. Sorry, guys. But yeah, that's really it for this video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Let me know what you want to see in the comments next, and I'll see you guys in the next video. All right, goodbye.